There's a sound that's been rolling across this country for over 200 years. It started as hooves and wooden wheels on packed dirt. Somewhere along the way, it became the low rumble of a diesel engine idling outside a truck stop at 4 a.m. Same job, same purpose. Get the goods from where they are to where they're needed. Feed the cities, stock the shelves, keep the country moving. Today, we're tracing the whole line, from horse-drawn freight wagons to the 15 million or so trucks on the American roads right now. This isn't just a story about machines getting bigger and faster. It's a story about the people who've always done this work, who they were in 1820, who they were in 1956 when the interstates opened, and who they are tonight, somewhere out there on I-80, holding a wheel, getting it done. Let's go back further than most people think to. Long before anyone said trucking industry, there was just freight, and freight moved on the backs of animals and the wheels animals pulled. In colonial America, moving goods any real distance meant one of two things: a boat on a river or canal, or a wagon on a road that was barely a road. Overland freight was slow, expensive, and genuinely dangerous. A wagon could break an axle, a horse could go lame, and a bad rainstorm could turn a route into impossible mud for a week. The wagon that defined this era was the Conestoga wagon, built by German immigrant wagon makers in Pennsylvania's Conestoga River Valley, starting in the early 1700s. These weren't the little covered wagons you picture from Western movies. They were freight haulers. Curved floors so cargo wouldn't shift on hills, iron-rimmed wheels, canvas stretched over hooped frames to keep out the weather. A team of 6 horses could pull one loaded with several tons of goods. The men who drove them were called teamsters, a word that's still with us, still on union halls and paycheck stubs over 150 years later. A teamster's life was its own trade, its own culture, long before there was a trucking industry to belong to. They knew their horses individually. They knew which taverns along the route would feed a man and stable a team overnight. They formed informal networks, the earliest version of what we'd now call a load board, except it was word passed at a tavern bar. There's something worth sitting on here: the isolation, the self-reliance, the pride in knowing a route better than anyone else. That's not new to trucking. That's inherited. A driver tonight checking his mirrors on a mountain grade in the dark is doing an old job. The tools changed, but the character required to do it well has not. By the mid-1800s, canals and then railroads started eating into long-haul freight. The railroad could move much more, faster, cheaper over longer distances. But here's the thing railroads could never solve: the last mile. A train can get a shipment of grain or dry goods to a depot in a mid-sized or even smaller town. Someone still had to get it from that depot to the actual store, the actual farm, the actual customer. That gap, depot to destination, became the permanent structural reason trucking would eventually exist as its own industry. It's the same gap Amazon delivery vans are filling today. That gap never really closed. It just changed shape. By 1900, horse-drawn freight was still doing the vast majority of local hauling in American cities. New York City alone had well over 100,000 horses working its streets, pulling ice wagons, beer wagons, produce carts, milk carts. The city literally had a manure problem, a public health crisis born entirely out of animal-powered logistics. That's worth remembering next time someone romanticizes the old days. The old days had their own version of exhaust. The first gasoline-powered trucks showed up around 1898 to 1900. Clunky, unreliable, expensive, and honestly kind of a joke to most freight haulers who trusted their horses a lot more than they trusted a newfangled engine. Early trucks broke down constantly. Roads outside cities were often just dirt, means a truck could get stuck just as easily as a wagon. Except now, you also had a busted radiator to deal with. What actually forced the shift wasn't civilian trucking, it was war. When World War I broke out, the U.S. Army needed a way to move enormous quantities of supplies to the front, faster and more reliably than horses could manage under artillery fire and mud. The military poured resources into truck development and logistics. Companies like Mack, White, Peterbilt, and others built trucks by the thousands for the war effort. Soldiers who'd never driven anything mechanical in their lives came home in 1918 having learned to operate, maintain, and trust motor vehicles under the worst possible conditions. Those returning soldiers were the first generation of professional truck drivers in the modern sense. Some of them came home, couldn't find the same work, and bought military surplus trucks on the cheap. They started their own small hauling operations. One man, one truck, hauling whatever a farmer or small manufacturer needed moved. And interestingly, the company I drive for started this way with one man and one truck in 1935. This is the literal origin of the American owner operator truck driver. It starts with a guy who learned to drive a truck in a war and came home with nothing to lose. Through the 1920s, trucking exploded, but chaotically. There was no real regulation. Anybody with a truck and willingness to work could haul freight at whatever rate they could negotiate on roads that were still mostly unpaved outside major cities. Rates crashed because there was zero structure. Truckers undercut each other into a race to the bottom and poverty. Railroads, watching their freight monopoly erode, lobbied hard for the government to rein trucking in. That set the stage for the next big turn. 1935. During the Depression, the Motor Carrier Act passes, and it changes everything. For the first time, interstate trucking companies had to get federal operating authority, a permit from the Interstate Commerce Commission. Rates had to be published and followed. Safety rules got real teeth for the first time. Hours of service limits actually appear in this era, born directly out of the recognition that exhausted drivers on primitive roads were dying at unacceptable rates. This is worth pausing on because it's a pattern that repeats throughout the whole history. First, the industry grows lawless and dangerous, and then regulation follows the wreckage. It happened in 1935. It happens again in different forms decades later with electronic logging devices. The shape of the argument, safety versus a driver's independence and ability to earn, is basically the same argument in 1937 as it is in a truck stop parking lot today. The Great Depression, brutally, was actually a growth period for trucking relative to rail. Trucks were more flexible. They could serve small towns and businesses that rail lines had abandoned or never actually reached. A trucking company needed far less capital to start than a railroad. So even as the broader economy collapsed, trucking's share of American freight kept climbing through the 1930s. Then World War II arrived, and trucking became a matter of national survival. The war effort needed to move troops, fuel, ammunition, and equipment at a scale and speed the country had never, ever attempted. The government essentially nationalized priority over trucking capacity. Fuel and tire rationing hit civilian trucking hard, but the war also proved decisively, permanently, that trucks could do things rail simply could not do. Reach anywhere, adapt instantly, and move on short notice. Truck manufacturing itself became a wartime industry. And again, just like World War I, a generation of men came home from World War II having learned engines, having learned logistics, having learned to drive under conditions nothing in peacetime could match. That generation didn't just join the trucking industry after the war, they built it. 1956, the Federal Aid Highway Act, President Eisenhower's interstate highway system. This is the biggest single infrastructure project in American history, and it is, without exaggeration, the event that makes modern trucking possible. Before the interstates, a cross country haul meant grinding through small town main streets, stoplights, tight turns, unpredictable local roads. After the interstates, a trucker could run coast to coast at sustained highway speed on limited access roads built specifically to handle heavy commercial loads. General Eisenhower had seen German Autobahns during World War II and understood the military and economic logic of a true national highway system. But what he built ended up reshaping American culture in ways beyond the military logistics he originally justified it with. Trucking became faster, more efficient, and critically, it became visible. The truck driver became a fixture of the American highway landscape, and by the 1960s and 70s, a fixture of American pop culture. This is the era of the trucker as folk hero. CB radios, originally a practical tool for truckers to warn each other about speed traps, road conditions, way stations, become a full-blown cultural phenomenon. Breaker, breaker, good buddy. You got your ears on out there? Trucker handles, trucker slang started bleeding into mainstream American speech. Country music leaned hard into trucking as a genre unto itself. Songs about the open road, about freedom, about a man and his rig against the world. Movies like Smokey and the Bandit and Convoy turned truckers into outlaws with a code, guys who bent the rules but lived by their own honor system. Now, there's a real tension worth naming here, one that still exists today. The trucker as romanticized folk hero, or steel cowboy, on the one hand, and the trucker as an invisible, undervalued laborer on the other. Both are actually true at the same time. The culture loves the idea of the trucker far more than it understands or compensates the actual work. And that gap between how a job is mythologized and how it's actually lived, that's a thread worth pulling on beyond just trucking. It's true of a lot of blue collar work in this country. We love the symbol. We're a lot less curious about the man who's been awake for 19 hours to keep that symbol running. Then 1980, the Motor Carrier Act of 1980, deregulation. Jimmy Carter signs it. Suddenly, the barriers to entry that had defined trucking since 1935 mostly disappear. Rates aren't set by government anymore. Getting operating authority becomes dramatically easier. The number of trucking companies explodes. Tens of thousands of new carriers within a few years. Many of them small operations. Many of them single owner operators trying their luck. Now, deregulation is genuinely contested history. Advocates say it drove down shipping costs, expanded service to small communities, and opened the industry to anyone willing to work hard. Critics say it gutted driver pay, crushed unionized freight jobs, and created a race to the bottom rate environment that's still shaping driver compensation today. Well, two things can be true at the same time. That's most of trucking history, honestly. Findings that cut in two directions depending on whether you're asking from the boardroom or from the driver's seat. From the 1980s forward, the story becomes less about roads and regulation and more about technology reshaping the day to day experience of the job itself. Satellite tracking and GPS start in the late 90s, early 2000s, and change dispatch forever. A company could know exactly where every truck in its fleet was in real time. That's efficiency for the business. For the driver, it also meant the end of a certain kind of autonomy. The open road got a lot less open when someone in an office 3 states away could see your exact location and speed at any moment. Then came the electronic logging device mandate, or ELDs. This started in 2016 and was fully enforced by 2019. The electronic logs replaced paper logbooks with automatic, tamper resistant digital tracking of hours of service. When I speak to the older drivers, they talk about the paper logs, which are essentially paper Gantt charts, as the funny papers, meaning they would keep two versions of their log, one for the DOT inspector and one for themselves. This is the modern echo of that 1935 tension I mentioned earlier: safety, regulation versus driver autonomy and earning potential. ELDs undeniably improved compliance with hours of service rules and, by most safety data, reduced fatigue related violations. It also just as undeniably took away the informal flexibility drivers had for decades to finish a load, find safe parking, or manage their own schedule around real world conditions like weather and traffic. Ask 10 drivers about ELDs today, and you'll get 10 opinions, most of them negative. And then there's the conversation everyone in this industry has heard 1,000 times: autonomous trucks, self driving freight. We covered that a few episodes ago. And for over a decade now, it's been 5 years away. The technology has made real progress, and companies are starting to run limited autonomous freight lanes on very predictable interstate routes in the good weather Southwest. But anyone who's actually driven, anyone who's backed a tanker into a tight dock, or tried to find where you hook up on the backside of a complicated industrial plant, or handled a load through a Pittsburgh snowstorm, or made the hundred small human judgment calls a real route demands, knows the gap between highway autopilot and replace the driver is enormous. And it's the last mile problem all over again. The same last mile gap that created trucking in the first place 200 years ago. It's exactly the gap and automation still can't close. Right now, the industry talks constantly about a driver shortage, depending on who you ask, anywhere from any tens of thousands to over 60,000 drivers short of what the country needs. But when you dig into that phenomena, it's not really a shortage of people willing to do the job and drive. It's a retention problem. Long haul trucking asks something of a person that very few jobs still ask: extended time away from family, irregular sleep, physical strain, and until fairly recently, a level of isolation that our culture wasn't built to talk about honestly. That isolation is real, and it's worth naming plainly without romance and without pity. The driver spends enormous stretches of time alone with his own thoughts, in a cab, at a truck stop, in a parking lot at 2 a.m. That's a specific kind of hard, and it teaches a specific kind of self reliance. It can also wear a person down in ways the industry is only now starting to seriously reckon with. Mental health resources for drivers and better dispatch practices, and real conversations about what life actually costs a person and their family. So here's where we want to land this. 200 years ago, a teamster sat on a Conestoga wagon, alone with 6 horses, trusting his knowledge of the route more than anything else, carrying goods that a community genuinely needed. Tonight, somewhere out there, a driver is sitting in a cab, alone, trusting his knowledge of the route, carrying goods a community genuinely needs. The technology is unrecognizable. The regulatory environment has been rebuilt from scratch 3 or 4 times over. The culture swung from ignoring truckers entirely to mythologizing them as outlaw folk heroes to where we are now, a strange mix of dependence and invisibility, where everyone needs the delivery and almost nobody thinks about the person who made it happen. But the actual character this work has always demanded: self reliance, a tolerance for solitude, kind of quiet competence when no one's watching most of the time. That hasn't changed at all. If anything, the thing this industry teaches a person, generation after generation, is that showing up and doing the hard, unglamorous, necessary work when no one's applauding is its own kind of grace. That was true for a teamster hauling flour to an Illinois market in 1820. It's true for a driver crossing 3 states tonight while the rest of us sleep. That's the story. Same job, same person, really, underneath 2 centuries of different machines. Thanks for riding along on this one. If you got a story from your own time behind the wheel, if you're a trucker, or from somebody in your family, I'd genuinely like to hear it. Reach out and we might feature it on a future episode. Until next time, keep that shiny side up.